Welcome to another week of CS 111B. This week I want to give a quick introduction to array lists and the generic mechanism, or generics. We want to look at how to use these array lists and to use them with the generic mechanism. Array lists, in a sense, are an object-oriented way to duplicate the behavior of an array with some added benefits. So let's quickly look at how an array might be used to store a couple strings. So this will be an array reference that could store strings. I'm going to store a bunch of names, and I might initialize this with a string array. Let's say room for 3 names. And then if I wanted to fill this up, I'd say first element maybe equals Ann, second element equals Kim, etc. So I could store names into an array. I want to do this with an array list instead. Array list is an object-oriented way to do this. And so that might look like this. I'll use an array list. You can see up here that I've imported Java util array list. That's the class we want to use. And how about I spell it right? When we use an array list, we want to use this generic mechanism. It's an interesting mechanism. The way to think about it, I think, is to say array list is a class. It's a data type, but it's incomplete. If we want to use the type, we have to complete it with what we're going to store inside. The array list is the storage type. We got to say what we're going to put inside it. And we do that with this angled bracket syntax. Inside the angled bracket, we put the data type we want to store. So there's a reference to an array list set up to store strings. And I could initialize it. Here we can just put empty brackets. What this means is the compiler knows what we want to store. Oops. And so we can leave these empty. You could put a string inside here. I think the compiler will take it, but it doesn't need it. You can see IntelliJ grays it out because it's not necessary. So this is our syntax for creating an array list. Here we allocate one. Now when we want to put names inside it, we say names, and then we use this dot operator to invoke a method on that object, and we can say add and Kim. What's cool about the array list is, unlike the array where we needed a specific size, we had the 3 in the square brackets before, with the array list we could add as many things as we want. And that's fine. So here I've added 4 names. And the array list is internally going to hold the machinery necessary to hold as many things as it needs. Inside the array list, there actually is an array, and if you fill up the original array, it'll double the size. This is the kind of stuff that we'll talk a lot about in CS 111C. Let's say I wanted to display this. I might say display names. This method doesn't actually exist yet, but I want to write it just so we can talk about what it would be like to pass this reference as a parameter into a display method. So to write that method, I'd say public static void display. And I'll set it up so that I can accept an array list of strings as a parameter. So I'll say the data type will be array list, and again I'll use this generic mechanism. I'm just going to call it n just to give it a different name. So it's going to be an array list of strings. And inside this, I could just loop through this and say for int I equals 0, I is less than, and then I want to loop through once for each number of strings in the array list. So here I could say n.size. Essentially, I'll ask the array list, you tell me how many things you have. We'll loop that many times. And for each one of these, I'll say print line, and then n, that's my reference to an array list, and then I'll use this method get, which also takes an index. It's kind of, again, the equivalent of the square brackets. So I'll loop through one at a time like this. So I've made an array list using this generic mechanism where I tell the array list what it is that it'll be storing. I made a reference named names. I used names to add to the array list, and then I passed that reference into the method. So here in the method, I needed to accept the right data type, an array list of strings, and then pass in the reference, and then here I use it with the get method. And get is my way to get items back out of the array list. If I say get 0, that's the first element, get 1 is the second element. So it's a little bit like the square brackets for getting something out of an array. So that's the topic of the week, to understand this little bit of machinery called the array list. It's a class, so it's very object-oriented. To understand the generic mechanism, that I always complete my array list data type with the data type that I want to store in it. And to think a little bit about references. This would be from last week when we talked about array references, and how they can be passed into a method, for instance, and here we would accept it. So the homework assignment this week is to make kind of a mock scores mechanism, something that might be at the end of like a game where we're going to keep track of top scores. And so I made a really simplified, maybe dumbed down version of the homework assignment just to get us thinking about this. And it looks like this. Let's walk through this main method. I make two different array lists, an array list of strings and an array list of integers. The strings are going to store names, and then the scores are going to store the scores associated with that names. Let me go back to this and talk about that. What's it like to create an array list that stores integers? Well, we can't do this. This would be cool. But array lists can't store primitive types. An int is just a primitive type. And so when you want to make an array list that stores a primitive type, you put this capital letter version of that. These are object-oriented versions of the primitives. And so these could be things like integers, or doubles, or booleans, whatever primitive we want to store in there. For us, we want to store integers, and so it looks like this. What I have here is my array list reference. Now let me make the array list that it'll refer to again. So that's new array list. And now that we have that array list, we can add integers to it. Whoa, excuse me. So notice here, we made an array list with strings, and now the add method accepts strings. Here we made an array list that accepts this integer type, and we can add integers. And this is how the generics work. And we're going to use this we're going to use these two array lists in the high scores assignment this week. Let me switch back to the simplified high scores assignment. That's here. And notice here the two array lists. So we have the names array list, stores strings, scores array list, stores integers. And we're going to use these in a technique that's sometimes called parallel array lists. That is to say, the names will store a sequence of names, and the scores will store the corresponding scores for each player using the same indexes. So the first name in the names array list will correspond to the first score in the scores array list. Second name corresponds to the second score. So let me take a second and just walk through this main method, and we'll try to describe what it does. What I do is I invoke a method that fills the arrays with names and scores. And then I print out before, and I display both of those together. So here I'm going to have to create a display method that does that. And then I do what in a sense is like a little bit of sorting. I'm going to find the largest score in the scores array. and I'm going to switch that to the first position. And then I'm going to switch the corresponding name with it. So I'm going to move the largest score first, and I'm going to move the name with it. Then I'll print out after, and I'll display the array lists again. Then finally I'll clear them, ask the user if they want to go in again, and come back around. Let's run it and see how that works, and then we can take a quick walk through the code. So here's the output. Before, I have Ann 38, Tom 38, Kim 61, Wen 51. Kim is the high scorer. These numbers are randomly generated, we'll see. After, I'm going to move that top score to the top. So Kim and 61 move to the top. Tom and Ann and Wen come after. Let's try again. Say, do you want to go again? Yes. So now we can look down through this and see Wen is the top score. Here's the scores and names. And so I moved Wen up to the top in this case and put the rest. In your case, you're going to ask the user for names and scores, and you're going to sort this whole array. But this gives a little bit of a similar picture. So now let's take a look. Here's the main method, and our question is, how do all these methods work? How do we fill these arrays, which are array lists? How do we display them? How do I go about putting the largest name and score first? And then finally I clear them and go again. This code is posted on the class website, and I hope it provides a starting point for our discussion this week. So take some time, read through these methods, make sure you understand how they work. They'll be really helpful with the homework assignments. Let's take a quick look at them now. Here's fill arrays. So it accepts a reference to the names array and a reference to the scores array. The names array it adds 4 names to. The scores array is another method in which we say fill this array list with 4 random scores. And we should look and see, well, how does this method work? Here's should go again. Take a look at that. It should look fairly familiar. Here's random scores. So I make a random object. Hopefully this sense of this being a reference and this being an object are beginning to become more and more familiar. What you'll see that it does, it goes through the array list count times. Count is a number passed in as a parameter, and it puts a random number in there between 0 and 100. Here's display. It takes 2 references, a reference to a names array list and a scores array list. It goes through the loop based on the name array list size, and it prints them out, the name and the tab and the score. And that's what we were seeing when we were running it before. Here's largest first. It takes an array of names and an array of scores. It invokes yet another method that says find the index of the largest score. And then it passes those into a swap function. This swap function I think will be most useful for your homework. Of all this sample code, this is the method I think you can use almost as is, in fact as is. It passes in the 2 arrays, and what it's saying here is swap the first element of each array list with I, and I is the index of the largest score. So you can see there it's going to take the largest score and the name associated with it and swap those to the beginning of both array lists. There's 2 methods we have to look at in order to understand this. One, how do we find the largest score, index of the largest score? And then 2, how do we swap them? The index of the largest looks like this. It starts off with the index being 0. It loops from 1 up to the size of the scores array list, and it just checks each time. Is the score at this current index larger than the score of the index of the largest? And if so, then that index becomes the index of the largest. Then finally we return it. So this is not sorting. This is kind of an ultra simplified version where we're just concerned with one element. We want to find the largest score and we want to, in a sense, swap it into the beginning. So that was index of largest. Now we're ready to swap. We want to pass in the 2 array lists and we want to swap these 2 indexes with each other. So here's index of largest. It takes those 2 references. So now we've passed this a number of times into subsequent methods. the names array list, and the scores array list, and also the two indexes we want to store, swap, which I just called I1 and I2. To swap them together, I'm first going to store temporarily one name and one score, the name and the score associated with the first index. Then I'm going to overwrite those. So here I call a method named set. Like the add method, the book goes over this really well. But basically it's saying set the array list at this index to whatever score comes here. And I'm going to take the score from the second index. And I'm going to do it the same with the name. I'll set the name of this index to the name that was at I2. Once I've moved I2 into that position, the I1 position, I can go back and take these temporaries and stick them into I2. So I'm going to call set again. This is a pretty typical swap maneuver, but what I'm doing here is I'm swapping both array lists at once. And this is what you're going to have to do in your sorting algorithm. Your sorting algorithm will do not just one swap, but maybe dozens of swaps, as many as necessary. And this method will be useful to keep your names array list and your scores array list in sync. That whenever you swap a score, you swap the corresponding name, and they keep lined up. So that's a quick breeze through of this code. The code is posted on the class website. Take a look at it and see if you can make sense of that. And whatever questions come up are good questions. Make sure you post those on the discussion board. We can really get to the bottom of this code, and I think that will set you up for both the reading and then for the homework assignment, the high scores homework assignment. All right, we'll see you guys online. Talk to you soon.